I don't know, the Forbin class, how to really unicol a light cruiser. So, the Forbin class. There are many scenarios in the world which involve the Unicol in this period in the 19th century. They particularly like to get involved in the development of cruisers and about, arguing against capital ships and all sorts of things. However, there's a problem. If you're going to rely on mass volleys of torpedo boats, you need something to command the torpedo boats. That's what you do. You need vessels to lead and command the torpedo boats. Now, I know there'll then be a development of torpedo boat destroyers by many navies, pretty much simultaneously resulting in this. And then eventually there are going to be some scout cruisers used by the British as destroyer leaders and various other vessels like that. Well, the Forbin class are arguably the first three purpose-built flotilla leaders, or torpedo flotilla leaders. And, well, there's just a few issues with that. Just a few tad issues with it. Now, the first issue, I would argue, is that they could only do 20 knots, which wasn't really that helpful and not really going to give them the capabilities they need. Also, and this is kind of interesting when you're dealing with torpedo boats, is they decide to fit them with a schooner rig and actually think they're going to sail. Because if you're operating torpedo boats and as part of the Unicol, you don't really need long range, you do need high speed. You're not planning on taking them anywhere else, are you? Because if you are, then it's going to be interesting to see how you get them there. The French Navy had built unprotected cruisers and what they called aviosos, or what we would probably term sloops, in the 1870s. But they were considered obsolescent, and their speeds, which were roughly 12 to 14 knots, meant they were ineffective as scouts. So, the Council de Travaux, that's the Council of Works, requested designs for small, emphasis on the small, but fast cruisers of about 2,032 tons, 2,000 long tons displacement. They were supposed to be able to be used for the main battle fleet or to lead squadrons of torpedo boats. Where have we heard this before? And the great, of course, Louis-Émile Bertin, who I've discussed before, had advocated for these sorts of vessels since 1875. He'd, of course, designed the Milan, another cruiser I have discussed before. And they used the Milan as the basis for developing into the Forbin class. Oh, my lord. So, how do I put this politely? In 1886, another Unicol proponent, Gabriel Chams, had published his book La Réforme de la Marine, the Reform of the Navy. It's always great when someone publishes that as their way of arguing for naval spending to be spent on what they want. The Reform of the Navy. Because the moment you have that title, that means there's already a problem with the Navy which needs to be fixed. And you're going to present the solution. It's a great way of framing your argument. The moment you put reform in your title, it sounds like we've got a system, it's working, but it's broken. And this is the solution of how to fix it. That's why you put reform in the title. It's a great way of phrasing it. Anyway, he had called for some commerce raiding cruisers, armed with, and I cannot say this for the life of me, I don't understand why they're focusing on 138.6mm, that's 5.46 inch guns, I do not know. I'm presuming he had a deal with a gun supplier who was selling those. Because 138.6 seems like a really weird millimeter gun system to go for, and 5.46 isn't even better. Any better. I could understand 5.5-inch gun. I could understand that. That would be 140mm roughly. I could understand that as being a sort of a gun you might go for. 5.46-inch? Huh? Who's developing that? And 138.6mm? Why not 140? It just smacks of being a very weird evolutionary path, just the moment you see that. These guns were considered useful because they were sufficient for the task of sinking merchant vessels. Speed of 20 knots, which would allow them to escape any stronger vessel. Now, here is the point I would make whenever you're designing a ship which is relying on speed. It better always be the fastest ship in service. If your ship's only saving grace is speed, it always has to be fastest, otherwise it will get killed. That is the reality. If a ship is not the fastest, you're in trouble. At which point, Theophile Urb, who's an admiral, and well, some people describe him as an ardent supporter of the Junocole. Others might describe him as a Junocole fanatic. Some might even go so further as to say he believed he was France's, before Jackie Fisher, equivalent of Jackie Fisher. And the reason we don't remember him like Jackie Fisher is because, well, it wasn't that good. Became naval minister at the time. Oh, isn't that great? An ideologue has become your minister. And he got the Inspector General of Naval Engineering, Marie de Bussy, to design such. Now, what I find interesting is he makes this request on the 1st of February 1886, and de Bussy submits a set of specifications that meet Orb's requirements on the very next day. Consider just how suspicious that is. Okay? You become naval minister. You then request a design on the 1st of February. This is the 1st of February. And on the 2nd of February, the specifications are submitted. The specifications for the design have been worked out in less than 24 hours, because it's got to be less than 24 hours. Just think about it. There's a time taken from going from the meeting spot, which is probably in the Naval Minister's office, to the Bussy's office. Then the Bussy will need to call in his various members of staff, his senior engineers, his surveyors, his planners, his industrial consultants, the people who he knows who are providing him with the information. They won't have those titles in that period, but they'll be fulfilling those roles. Talk to them about what's possible. Then we'll need to get them to write it down and work it out, and then they'll need to start sketching up plans so they can work out what will roughly fit together, and get all that done, and then have time to schedule another appointment and arrive at it next day. Oh, and probably also sleep and eat in that time as well. Yeah, me thinking that design was prepared already. Or at least the vast majority of the work was already done. The plan was originally for 19.5 knots of speed, a range of 2,400 nautical miles at 10 knots, the two 138.6mm guns, and a 40mm curved armour deck. This is a protected cruiser. And then it took a month for the Bussy to prepare a more detailed design. So That's approved on 20th of March. Again, though, how do I put this politely? Working out the specifications in 24 hours is interesting. Considering the size, capabilities of staff they have at this period, and the other tasks they have going on, and the complexity of running the French system, which is very different from running the British procurement system, even at this point. It's frankly an amazing feat that they got it done in a month. Again, the suspicion to me would be that they had a design and they had some rough framework designs already, a specification and some rough framework designs already worked out on the 2nd of February. And then they spent a month actually turning them into something realistic and proper. They then allocated 3 of the vessels to the 1887 budget. And this was basically Orb's commerce raider cruiser budget. Forbin, Sukhov were built in government shipyards from Debussy's plans. The third vessel, always fun, was to be built from a private shipyard, and so they run a little competition. It's always nice to run a little competition. And that competition developed into the Forbin Class. Now, they did actually build a third of this class. And I should probably talk about that specification. So, displacement, 1,857 tons. That's about what a Travel Class destroyer is supposed to be. So, it does fit, doesn't it? Ooh, it does fit. That's about the level you're looking at for a destroyer leader in this sort of period. Again, destroyer leaders, torpedo leaders, seem to keep coming around to roughly the same figures. It's almost as if you're looking for a vessel which has very similar characteristics to a destroyer, but is just that little bit more powerful so it can function as a leader. So it's amazing, really. 96.1 meters in length, 9.33 meters in beam, 4.5 meters in draft. 6 fire tube boilers supplying 6,200 indicated horsepower, 2 steam compound engines driving 2 screws. They could achieve a range of 2,400 nautical miles at 10 knots. Also brought a schooner sail plan to the table. Fun. I do love that Microsoft Word does not do. I need to do a check. No more checks. Anyway. Sorry, it's supposed to be brought, not bruh. Ah, well. Complement 209. The 347mm guns are interesting to me, as are the full 37mm guns. It's a nice sort of addition that gives them some capabilities, especially with dealing with smaller craft. The 4 14-inch torpedo tubes. Well, that actually makes them useful if you're going to be working with destroyers. This is my point I've made before about the British scout cruisers. That if they're going to be acting as destroyer leaders, they need more torpedoes. And in this period, having 4 meant you had more than most torpedo boats. It really did. Honestly, there is a lot to commend themselves to this design, and it's a well-balanced design for what it's expected to be. But again, I keep returning to that whole 20 knots for keeping up with torpedo boats and the fact that they've fitted the schooner sail rig. It's just... It seems to me, again, it's a case of people not thinking through exactly what they're doing. Yes, you're building cruisers which are going to be cruising around the world, but if these vessels are going to be your primary assets for looking after your fleet and directing your forces closer to France, as the Juno needs, then surely the sail plan can be dropped and the speed needs to be increased. Because these are going to need to be the flotillas, they're going to need to be a reactive force. they have interesting careers. And I do love the sort of, well, let's be honest, that is a bit of a rambow shaping. It is certainly, it's certainly large, although strange enough, they're not intended for ramming attacks. They are not. The thing is, they're not supposed to be doing ramming attacks. They have this whole thing, and it's not intended for a ramming attack. It's kind of a strange scenario going on here. I'm never quite sure how it came to be, but it did. And yeah, it's a strange scenario. Anyway, if we get on with that, Forbin. Well, let's see. She spent most of her 1890s, unsurprisingly, because she was mostly for homework, in the reserve squadron based in the Mediterranean Sea. She participated in annual training exercises. And she was usually in reserve. Now, she had an ammunition fire related to Poudre B, which was a first sort of smokeless propellant in 1901, which caused some damage, but she was still reactivated in 1906 for service with the Northern Squadron. And by 1911, she'd been moved to the Moroccan Naval Division. She was then converted into a collier in 1913 and was used for that role until she was struck from Naval Register in 1919. She has an interesting time while she's in reserve squadron. As said, she's usually activated for exercises. Shooting practice, simulating a blockade squadron, scouting operations in the Western Mediterranean. During some of those operations, torpedo boats Audacious and Musketeer collided, and Forbin had to take Audacious in tow back to Toulon. And this was in 1893. In 1895, she was serving alongside Safax and Milan, of course, her predecessor in role. And they were assigned to Fleet C, which represented a hostile Italian fleet, which was tasked with defeating Fleet A and B. It's kind of interesting to note that the French have divided their forces and have said they're going to be inferior to fleet, individually inferior to Fleet C, but combined they're superior in strength. So they've set themselves up with a task which is actually probably quite realistic for testing these things out because, well, let's be honest, the odds are the French have to have a northern squadron and a Mediterranean squadron and other squadrons around their empire, whereas the Italians will just concentrate majorly and primarily in the Mediterranean, which means they'll be always able to outnumber, at least initially, any French force. It was not until 1896 that she had her mainmast removed, along with all her torpedo tubes, though. Received 5 more 47mm guns, and her existing boilers were replaced by Nikolaus-type water tube boilers, which used both mixed coal and oil. She spent most of her time from that point on, though, in the reserve fleet, especially after, well, the Poudre B charges went off. 5 men were burned in the accident, but the fire did not detonate any adjacent charges, and the toxic fumes nearly asphyxiated some of the crew that night, but they mostly were got through okay. Now, this is, well, Col de John. And I haven't got a discussion of Surkoff, and the reason I haven't got a discussion of Surkoff is because I haven't got a picture of Surkoff. I can't find one. Not one which I'm allowed to use. Col de John is, of course, the third of the class. She was the one built at Ateliers et Chantiers de Saint-Nazaire, Bernard, which is, of course, one of the yards in Saint-Nazaire. The other two vessels were both built in Arsenal de Rochefort and Arsenal de Cherbourg, so they're both built by the French naval bases. Ateliers et Chantiers de Saint-Nazaire-Punot, of course, was the one famously started by John Scott, a Scottish engineer. Colleton is, well, she was launched in December 1888, commissioned for sea trials on 20th March 1819. These are conducted at Brest. Her propulsion system fails and had to be completely replaced. As such, it's not really surprising that she is eventually placed in third category of reserve, which basically means, first category means we will call on you when we immediately need you, and we will get you ready very quickly. Second category means you're going to be mostly kept ready to be called upon, and we're probably going to call you. Third category means, oh good lord, what have we got? We can't get rid of you, but we really don't think we're going to activate you. There is theoretically a category below it as well, but in practice, no. Because you would never admit you have a ship in that category. What is interesting is that she doesn't actually have her new engine installed till 1893. And therefore trials conducted with those engines in 1894, but are stopped due to excessive friction in the engines. They were causing so much vibration that the ship's compasses were not usable, and actually caused a new generation of compasses to start to be developed, because it was realized at that point you not only had to box compasses against magnetic interference, you had to defend them from vibratic interference, let's call it that. It causes an interesting evolution in the navies of the world. It's where sort of we start to see the modern developments that lead to the modern compasses and the systems we have in modern compasses actually being developed. She finally ran acceptable trials in June 1894, and actually she managed to reach a top speed of 20.4 knots using forced draft. Though she was still not ready to service until August. There were a few things which needed to be changed. So August 1894 is when she comes into service. She'd been ordered in 1887. She's not exactly a big ship, but it had been 7 odd years. And she's commissioned in September. The same day she's commissioned, she's placed in active service and assigned to the Northern Squadron. It's almost as if they've put so much money in here they're deciding they're going to have to use that. The Northern Squadron was actually only in commission for about 4 months a year. At the time, it consisted of Furiex, a coastal defense ship, Requiem, Victoris, and Suffren, 3 ironclads, and the armoured cruiser Latouche Treville, and the protected cruisers Jean Bart and her sister Surkoff. She took part in the annual fleet manoeuvres in July 1895. These are kind of interesting manoeuvres because, well, they involve an amphibious assault in Quiberon Bay and then a blockade of Rochefort and Cherbourg. They concluded in 23rd of July. In 1896, she starts to move into different units. And eventually she's part of 3rd Division, which joins up with the coastal defense ship Bouvines and our favourite armoured cruiser of this channel, the Dupe de l'Homme, and was representing the enemy squadron. On 24th August 1896, she was taken out of service and placed in reserve at Lorient, remaining in commission but in reserve. So a sort of first-class reserve. It's kind of interesting that she basically, well, no, it's kind of interesting, but a testimony to the quality of her engineering, that despite most pictures actually arriving of her, She doesn't move that much of this, and this might come to do with the fact, and please note I'm using someone else's translation of this, because it's Stephen Roberts' French Warships in the Age of Steam. This cruiser, and this was according to the Maritime Prefect that oversaw reserve ships in Lorient and writing in 1905, this cruiser has always given rise to problems, and it would be imprudent to rely on her now. She was decommissioned in June 1905 and struck in August, thereafter being employed as an ammunition storage hulk in Lorient. Scrapped in 1906. So, Surkov. Well, presumably, considering her usage, she was built more like Forbin than Coddlodon. Admittedly, she was one of the other ones constructed in a marine arsenal. However, by 1896, she'd been reduced to the second category of reserve. This is despite Surkov, and that's what I'm discussing at this point, having only been laid down in 1886 and launched in 1888 and commissioned first in 1889. So she's second category reserve by 1896. That's how the pace of technology and things are moving at this point. This means they're retained in a state that allows them to be mobilised only in the event of a major war, rather than emergencies. She was actually mobilised in 1897 to participate in the manoeuvres with the Northern Squadron. But this year was kind of different in that the squadron saw the protected cruisers Sfafax and Taj simulate a hostile fleet steaming from the Mediterranean Sea to attack France's Atlantic coast. Again, it seems rather like probably the Italians at this point, if they're doing that. And this was one of the first exercises where Surkov and the rest of the Northern Squadron actually managed to intercept the cruisers and defeat them. Previously, they'd failed. Sometimes. She stays mostly with the Northern Squadron. She just keeps staying with it, and even as it gets older, she is still there. Mainly because the thing that's counterbalancing the fact that they're using the older ironclads, the older armoured cruisers, the older this, the older that, is the fact that they're supposed to have the torpedo flotillas with them, and this thing is the thing that's supposed to lead them. In 1902, she was sent to join the French squadron in East Asia. This, at the time, included 5 other protected cruisers, and it was considered a good purpose for her. She then returned to France at some point before 1904, assigned again to the Northern Squadron, and was kept in commission for 6 more months with the rest of the squadron, but with a reduced crew. She remained with that squadron till 1908, and by which time that unit consisted of 8 armoured cruisers and 4 other protected cruisers on her, so a total of 13 major ships. In 1914, Surkov was allocated to the patrol squadron stationed in Brest. This was due to the fact France had a severe shortage not just of decent capital ships, but of smaller cruisers and of all sorts of vessels. She remained in service until 1916, when she transferred to the Gulf of Guinea to replace Friant. Then she moved to Gibraltar, where in August she was disarmed and converted into a depot ship. She thereafter supports submarines based in French Morocco, serving this capacity until 1919, and she's not struck from Naval Register until 1921, when she's sold to be broken up. That is the story of Surkov. And it is an interesting story. These ships are interesting ships. They provide us with an insight into some of the practicalities of the Junocole that are often forgotten. We focus in on the armoured cruisers, we focus in on the torpedo boats. These are the big assets, the principal assets of it. But the facilitators of the Junocole are often ignored. The facilitators of having a raiding squadron have got to be supply ships, which, frankly, the Junocole seems to, a school as a whole, most of its practitioners seem to just rely on this idea that we'll be able to change merchant ships and find them somewhere to do this role. In terms of cruisers in a smaller spectrum, they mainly ignore them because, of course, they want the big ranged armoured cruisers to go on and the first class protected cruisers, etc., which makes them have a real problem with the smaller cruisers for doing constabulary duties, presence missions, those sort of things, especially modern ones. Because really their only role for them is to act as torpedo boat leaders. And this both is a good and a bad thing. It's a good thing in that it gives them a role. It's a bad thing in that the role puts them in a scenario where they are going to be quickly not able to do their job. And why do I say they're going to be quickly not able to do their job? Well, that's because if we consider the Forbin Class, which are some of the first torpedo boats France has, procured in 1886 onwards, had a top speed of 19 knots. So 20 knots is good. Okay? Forbin Class, for some reason, 16 knots. Not sure what happened there. But in 1888, they get from Thornycroft the Courier Class, which have a top speed of 23.5 knots. Then they get the Avant-Garde Class. Yes, I do admit there was a torpedo boat class called the Avant-Garde Class, which could do 25 knots. This can do still do 20 knots. The Ageo Class, 20 knots, but they only built one of those. No, hang on. Yeah, pretty much only one. And then they have built some modified versions. And various other things. Then we have the Chevalier Class. And these vessels are all getting faster, because eventually, in 1898, you have the Cyclone Class. Now, the Cyclone Class, they can do 29 knots. The Mistral Class, made in 1901, could do 26 knots. And all sorts of ships come afterwards, and they keep, as a rule, getting faster. And they can keep the speed up for longer, and faster, and longer. And these ships all have engine troubles. They all have engines which really can't keep up that top 20 knots for a full time, let alone faster. So coordinating your torpedo boats, you can't keep up with them. This is the whole problem for destroyer leaders, and one of the reasons why the Royal Navy has troubles with the scout cruisers is that their own torpedo boat destroyers end up getting faster than these vessels. And when I say faster, faster by a significant amount. Now, today, that wouldn't matter, because you'd be doing the command and control by radio, by all sorts of systems. In the 1890s, the 1880s, and the 1900s, you're doing command and control by flags, by signals. Which means you need to be not just within visual range, but you need to be within visible visual range. You need to be at a point that you can command and control these ships. Which means they either need to slow down and keep pace with you, fine, but then the moment you want to order them to go and attack, they dive off, and you no longer have control. So they basically become a weapon you fire, and then you forget. That's not sensible when your entire strategy is dependent on those boats being a core part of the strategy. That's basically saying, we're going to treat you like, I don't know, Civil War era English. When I say English Civil War, I mean, of course, the War of the Four Kingdoms. You know, that sort of era of royalist cavalry, who would be charge the enemy, do absolutely massive damage, because they were excellent horsemen, and then would go off and enjoy themselves in the baggage train and do whatever they wanted. Whereas the parliamentary cavalry, which tended to have their horses supplied and not come from such rich a background, and tended to be more unused to being seated on a horse and had to be more trained and develop their time for it, were disciplined. They weren't as good, in terms of their initial impact, but the fact is you could call them and then use them again. And use them again. You did that because their commanders kept pace on them and kept them under tight control. It makes them a reusable asset. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and thank you for watching. And actually that leads us to today's question. Today's question is forgotten parts of strategy. So, what do I mean? Well, when we talk about the Junocol, as I said, we always remember the armoured cruisers, we remember the destroyer, the torpedo boats, and those things. We forget these vessels. We forget the torpedo boat leaders. So, what other vessels, what other equipment gets forgotten? If I was going for one in the army, I would often say the vehicle that you tend to get forgotten is everyone forgets the recovery vehicles. Everyone remembers the things which go bang bang. They forget the fact that you need an engineering recovery vehicle for that. Because if it goes wrong, especially as it's going to need to be a specialised vehicle because it's going to have to recover that vehicle in a war zone. And you're going to have to risk it, and skilled mechanics probably to do it. The amount of times people forget it. They do. It's like having conversations with people and going, why are you still fitting these sort of facilities to do towing onto modern warships? Because if they get damaged, but they're still afloat, then we can tow them home. Wouldn't we call them a tug? Tug might not be anywhere nearby. Tug would be a sensible thing to have, and that's actually something we can joke about with the Russians, but actually taking a tug everywhere in the world is not always the most stupid thing in the world for damage control. But, yeah, you're going to need to be able to tow them yourself. There are many things which some people like to try and delete. Anyway, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and yeah. Forgotten parts of components of strategies and operations. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed.